The snow was falling in thick, silent waves as Helena stared at the empty plate in front of her. The clinking of forks and muffled laughter from neighboring apartments only deepened the stillness of her own tiny kitchen. The aroma of a reheated lasagna she'd taken out of the freezer hours earlier lingered in the air, but her appetite was long gone. Christmas was supposed to be warm, full of laughter and connection, yet here she was, alone in a home that felt colder with every passing second. She had worked tirelessly for this evening. Saving up every dollar she could spare, she had planned a simple but heartfelt dinner to bring her fractured family back together. Her mother, distant since her father's passing, her sister, lost in her own whirlwind of ambitions, and Daniel, the man she had hoped would become her forever. She had wanted this dinner to be a bridge, something to remind them all that love was worth the fight, even in a world that revolved so heavily around money and its harsh grip on their lives. But the empty chair across from her said everything. Daniel wasn't coming. Neither were her family members. A single message from Daniel had shattered her last vestige of hope. "I'm sorry, Helena. I can't do this anymore." No explanation, no closure, just the confirmation that he'd been seeing someone else for months. She hadn't cried when she read it, not immediately. The shock had muted her emotions like a heavy blanket smothering a fire. But now, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the tears flowed freely, an unwelcome guest at her solitary table. Helena stood abruptly, wrapping herself in a coat and scarf. She couldn't sit in that silence anymore. She grabbed her keys and stepped out into the night, the chill biting her skin as she walked aimlessly down the snow-dusted streets. The city was alive with holiday cheer, lights twinkling in windows and children's laughter echoing through the air. But Helena felt like a ghost, moving unnoticed through a world that no longer felt like her own. As she walked, her thoughts spiraled. She thought about the sacrifices she'd made to keep her life afloat, working extra hours at a job that barely paid enough to cover rent, skipping meals to save money, and always being the one to reach out to loved ones who never seemed to reciprocate. Her finances were a constant source of stress, a shadow that loomed over every decision. And now, even the people she had fought to hold on to were slipping away. Was it all worth it? She wanted to believe that something better awaited her, but the weight of disappointment was crushing. Turning a corner, Helena's foot caught on something, nearly sending her sprawling onto the icy pavement. She steadied herself and looked down, her breath visible in the cold air. There, lying half buried in the snow, was a small black leather bag. It was worn, but elegant, the kind of accessory she'd only seen in expensive boutiques. She picked it up hesitantly, glancing around to see if anyone was searching for it. The street was deserted. Curiosity overrode caution as she opened the bag. Inside, she found a stack of crisp, unfamiliar bills, foreign currency that looked valuable, and an envelope sealed with a golden wax stamp. The ornate A embossed on the wax caught the light, gleaming against the dark fabric of her gloves. Her heart raced. Who would leave something like this on the street? Was it a mistake? A trap? She looked over her shoulder, the sensation of being watched prickling her skin, but the night remained still. She debated whether to open the envelope, her mind wrestling with the possibilities. Was this a lifeline or a burden waiting to unravel her life further? After what felt like an eternity, she broke the seal and unfolded the thick, cream-colored paper inside. The handwriting was elegant, almost regal, and the message was simple but perplexing. "You've been chosen. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. The address below. Come alone." Beneath the words was an address she didn't recognize. Her pulse quickened, the invitation igniting a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Who had chosen her, and for what purpose? The snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in silence as Helena clutched the bag to her chest. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, an ember of hope mixed with trepidation. What choice did she have? Her life as she knew it was in shambles. Perhaps, she thought, this was the universe's way of offering her an escape, or perhaps it was another cruel twist of fate. Either way, she knew she couldn't ignore the pull of that mysterious letter. Tomorrow, she would find out. If you've ever felt that life throws unexpected twists at you, leave a comment below about what kept you moving forward. Your story might inspire someone else. The morning light streamed through the thin curtains of Helena's small apartment, casting soft patterns on the walls. She hadn't slept. The envelope with its cryptic message sat on her nightstand, untouched since she'd brought it home. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. She had considered tossing it away, convincing herself it was just some elaborate prank. But the weight of the bag, with its neatly stacked bills, and the undeniable elegance of the letter told a different story. Helena's thoughts churned as she went through the motions of her morning. Her coffee tasted bitter, despite the sugar she stirred in absent-mindedly, and the toast she managed to burn felt like an afterthought. Questions filled the space where her usual quiet routines had been. Who had sent the letter? Why her? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, what would happen if she didn't go? By the time the afternoon rolled around, the city outside seemed to buzz with energy. Families strolled through snow-covered streets, shopping bags in hand, while holiday carolers gathered on busy corners. But for Helena, the festive hum of the world was drowned out by the growing tension in her chest. Her curiosity was becoming unbearable, clawing at her resolve. She pulled the letter from her nightstand again, tracing the delicate loops of the handwriting. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Formal, deliberate, as if each stroke carried meaning. The address, etched in the same ink, revealed nothing she could place. It wasn't a part of the city she knew well, and that only deepened the mystery. Helena found herself rummaging through her closet, pulling out a coat she hadn't worn in years. It still fit, though it was slightly snug around her shoulders. She slipped it on and grabbed her bag. As she left the apartment, a wave of doubt washed over her. Was she being reckless? But as quickly as the thought came, it was drowned out by a quiet, insistent voice in her mind. You have nothing to lose. The address led her to a neighborhood she'd only seen in passing. The kind of place where the streets were lined with towering iron gates, behind which stood grand houses that seemed to belong in another world. Helena felt like an intruder as she walked, her boots crunching against the pristine snow. Every turn brought her closer to the location scrawled on the letter, and her heart pounded with each step. When she finally reached the gate, marked by the matching A symbol from the wax seal, she hesitated. The house beyond was enormous, its sharp gables and sweeping balconies framed by meticulously trimmed hedges. The glow of warm light from its windows contrasted starkly with the chill of the evening. She looked around, half expecting someone to step out and stop her, but there was no one. The gate clicked open as she approached, as if it had been waiting for her. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside, the gravel crunching underfoot. Helena could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her, but it was too late to turn back. The front door opened before she could even knock. A tall woman with piercing blue eyes and an air of unshakable confidence stood before her. Helena recognized her instantly from the party the night before. Anna. You came, Anna said, her voice smooth but not unkind. She stepped aside, gesturing for Helena to enter. The interior of the house was just as intimidating as its exterior. Everything gleamed, from the polished floors to the chandeliers that cast soft light over the space. It smelled faintly of cedar and something floral, a scent Helena couldn't quite place. Follow me, Anna said, leading her down a long corridor. Helena's unease grew with every step. Anna stopped at a large set of double doors and turned to face her. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something, she said, her expression unreadable. Why are you here? The question caught Helena off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, but hesitated. Why was she here? Was it desperation, curiosity, or something deeper she couldn't yet name? I don't know, Helena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ina studied her for a moment, then nodded as if she'd expected the answer. That's honest. Honesty is important. She pushed the doors open, revealing a room that seemed to swallow Helena whole. It was an office, though the term didn't quite capture the grandeur of the space. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that smelled of time and wisdom. A massive desk sat at the center, and behind it, a man stood waiting. His presence was commanding, his gaze sharp as it landed on Helena. "This is Samuel," Anna said, her voice taking on a new tone, almost reverent. "He'll explain everything." Helena felt a chill run down her spine as Samuel stepped forward. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see right through her. "You're late," he said, his voice low and measured. Helena swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. The room, the man, the circumstances, all of it felt like a test she wasn't prepared for. "I didn't know if I should come," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Samuel tilted his head slightly, a flicker of a smile crossing his lips. "But you did," he said, as if that was all that mattered. Helena's heart raced as she tried to make sense of his words, of the entire situation. She had walked into a world she didn't understand, but something told her there was no turning back now. Helena woke to the grey light of morning, filtering through the lace curtains in a guest room that was far too grand for her. The events of the night before felt unreal, like the remnants of a dream she couldn't quite shake. She had been led to this room after Samuel's terse introduction, with little explanation beyond Anna's assurance that all her questions would soon be answered. Sleep had been fitful, her thoughts a storm of uncertainty and cautious hope. As she rose and dressed in the simple outfit she had brought with her, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her reflection startled her. There was something unfamiliar in her eyes, a glimmer of determination that hadn't been there before. Whatever was happening, she would face it head-on. The knock at the door was expected, yet still jarring. Anna stood there, impeccably dressed, her presence as commanding as ever. "Breakfast is served," she said simply, her tone neutral but firm. Helena followed Anna down a wide staircase that opened into a sunlit dining room. The table, adorned with fine china and silverware that gleamed under the light, was a stark contrast to the modest meals Helena was used to. Samuel was already seated at the head of the table, engrossed in a newspaper. He didn't look up as she sat. Instead, he gestured toward the food laid out before them. "Eat," he said brusquely. "We'll talk when you're finished." Helena hesitated, unsure of the rules in a setting so far removed from her world, but the hunger gnawing at her stomach won out, and she reached for a slice of bread. As she ate, she couldn't help but steal glances at Samuel. There was something enigmatic about him, something that made her both wary and curious. When the plates were cleared, Samuel finally folded his newspaper and looked at her directly. "You must be wondering why you're here," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I am," Helena admitted, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "I need an assistant," he said, the simplicity of his words clashing with the gravity in his tone. "Someone who can handle delicate matters. Anna believes you have potential." Helena blinked, caught off guard. "But you don't?" she asked, surprising even herself with the boldness of her question. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Samuel's lips. "You'll have to prove me wrong," he said. The conversation that followed was sparse, punctuated by long silences as Samuel explained the nature of the work. It was unlike any job Helena had ever encountered. part logistical, part investigative. He needed someone discreet, resourceful, and unafraid of challenges. The tasks were vague, but the stakes were clear. Failure was not an option. Helena listened intently, the weight of his words sinking in. The mention of finances, deals, and high-stakes negotiations hinted at a world far removed from her own struggles to make ends meet. It was daunting, but there was a part of her that felt exhilarated by the prospect. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. Samuel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her quick decision. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," she said, more firmly this time. "I have nothing to lose." Samuel nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll begin tomorrow." Anna walked her back to the guest room after breakfast, her demeanor softer now that the formalities were over. "You made a brave choice," she said as they reached the door. "But be prepared. Samuel is not an easy man to work for." Helena didn't need the warning. She could see the challenge that lay ahead, and she was ready for it. As she settled back into the room, her mind raced with possibilities. Who was Samuel really? And why had Anna chosen her for this role? The questions lingered as the hours passed, but one thing was certain. Her life had already begun to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Helena stood outside Samuel's study, her pulse quickening as she prepared for her first day. The air felt heavy, and the grand hallway leading to his door seemed endless. She adjusted the simple blouse Anna had loaned her, its fine fabric a sharp contrast to her usual worn-out wardrobe. The house's opulence was already beginning to feel suffocating, a constant reminder of the world she'd stepped into. Anna's words from the previous night echoed in her mind. "Be prepared. Samuel is not an easy man to work for." Helena clenched her fists, steeling herself for whatever awaited her. She knocked on the heavy oak door, her knuckles sounding hollow against the wood. "Enter," came Samuel's voice, crisp and commanding. She pushed the door open to find him seated behind an expansive desk cluttered with papers and files. The room was as imposing as the man himself. Dark wood paneling, towering bookshelves, and an air of gravitas that made Helena feel small. "Sit," Samuel said, without looking up from the document he was studying. Helena obeyed, settling into the chair opposite him. She waited in silence, the seconds stretching into an unbearable stillness. When he finally looked at her, his gaze was sharp, dissecting her with an intensity that made her stomach knot. "Your task today is straightforward," he said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. "This contains the details of a project I'm overseeing. I need you to organize the key points and create a summary, concise, accurate, and on my desk by noon." Helena opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a web of legal jargon, financial data, and correspondence that seemed impenetrable at first glance. The complexity was staggering, but she nodded, determined not to show hesitation. "Understood," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the task. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line, neither approving nor dismissing her response. "Good. You may use the office down the hall. Anna will show you the way." Helena rose, clutching the folder tightly as she followed Anna out of the room. Once they were in the hallway, Anna glanced at her, an amused smile playing on her lips. "He doesn't go easy on anyone," she said. "Don't take it personally." "I won't," Helena replied, though her heart was racing. The office Anna led her to was smaller, but no less intimidating, with a sleek desk and a view of the sprawling grounds outside. Helena sat down, the folder spread out before her. She felt a pang of doubt as she stared at the labyrinth of information. But then she thought of everything she'd endured to get to this moment. The loneliness, the betrayals, the constant battle to stay afloat. She had faced worse than a stack of papers. Hours slipped by as she worked, her focus sharpening with every page she read. The numbers and terms began to make sense, forming a picture of Samuel's dealings. She realized the documents hinted at something far beyond ordinary business. There were financial agreements that bordered on secrecy, investments in ventures that carried both immense risk and extraordinary potential. By the time she finished, her head was pounding, but she had distilled the chaos into a clear and concise summary. She carried the finished report back to Samuel's study, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to him. He skimmed the pages, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, though fleeting. "This will do," he said simply, placing the report on his desk. "You've done well for your first task, but this is just the beginning." Helena exhaled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. She knew better than to expect praise, but his words felt like a victory nonetheless. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "Do you know why I chose you for this position?" he asked suddenly. Helena hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I don't," she admitted. "Good," he said, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Keep it that way." The cryptic remark left her with more questions than answers. As she returned to the guest room that evening, her mind raced with thoughts of Samuel, his hidden motives, and the strange connection Anna seemed to have with it all. The weight of the day's events pressed down on her, but beneath the exhaustion was a spark of determination. Whatever this world was, its rules, its dangers, she was in it now, and she was going to find out the truth. The library was darker than Helena remembered. The tall windows that usually let in streams of natural light were now shadows against the night, and the only illumination came from the amber glow of a desk lamp at the far end of the room. She had spent the day in a haze of tasks and instructions, the rhythm of work leaving her little time to reflect on her growing unease. But now, the quiet hours had drawn her back to this place, where something about the air felt heavy, as though the room itself carried secrets. She walked slowly past the rows of shelves, her fingers brushing the spines of books whose titles she couldn't read in the dim light. Her mind replayed the events of the day, her interaction with Samuel, the impossible demands, and the brief glimpses of humanity she thought she saw in him, only for them to vanish just as quickly. Then she saw it. A book, slightly ajar on one of the shelves. It was a small detail, something she might have overlooked if not for the strange sensation that she was being drawn toward it. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. The house was silent, its stillness broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood. Helena pulled the book from the shelf, its cover embossed with gold lettering, too faded to decipher. As she opened it, a single piece of paper slipped out and floated to the ground. Her pulse quickened as she bent to pick it up, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The letter was written in the same elegant script as the invitation she had received days earlier. But this message was far less ambiguous. "The truth lies where the heart was last broken. Find it and you will understand." The words were both cryptic and unsettling, and yet they ignited a curiosity Helena couldn't suppress. What truth? Whose heart? And why had this been hidden here, in a room Samuel clearly used frequently? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable in the stillness of the house. Footsteps. Helena quickly slipped the letter into her pocket, her heart racing as she placed the book back on the shelf. She turned just as the door opened and Samuel stepped inside. His sharp eyes immediately locked onto her, and for a moment, the air between them felt electric. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone neutral but his gaze probing. Helena forced a small smile, hoping it masked the storm inside her. "Just exploring," she said, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Samuel studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "This house can be overwhelming," he said, walking past her to the desk. He placed a stack of papers on its surface and began to organize them, his movements precise. Helena lingered near the shelves, unsure whether to stay or excuse herself. Samuel's presence filled the room, making her acutely aware of the space between them. She was about to speak when he broke the silence. "Do you know what this room is to me?" he asked, his back still turned to her. She hesitated, unsure of what he wanted her to say. "A place to work?" Samuel chuckled softly, the sound low and almost bitter. "It's a place for memories," he said, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, pain, in his eyes. "Every book, every piece of paper in this room holds a part of my past. Some are lessons, some are mistakes, and some—" He trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the shelves as though searching for something. Helena felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of his words settling heavily on her. She wanted to ask more, to press him for answers, but the intensity of the moment held her back. "You should get some rest," Samuel said abruptly, his tone shifting back to its usual brusqueness. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Helena nodded, slipping out of the room without another word. As she climbed the stairs to her guest room, her mind was a whirl of thoughts. Samuel's cryptic remarks, the letter she had found, the unsettling sense that she was being pulled deeper into something she couldn't yet understand. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't have the edges for. When she reached her room, she locked the door behind her and retrieved the letter from her pocket. She read it again, the words burning into her mind. "The truth lies where the heart was last broken." Helena didn't know what it meant, but she was certain of one thing. The answers she sought were closer than she realized. And with every step she took in this house, she was walking further into a world that would change her forever. The morning brought a subdued light that filtered through the frost-laden windows, casting intricate shadows on the hardwood floor of Helena's room. She hadn't slept much. The letter's cryptic message haunted her thoughts, replaying in her mind like a haunting refrain. She clutched it tightly in her hand, the edges creased from her restless grip. The truth lies where the heart was last broken. Helena's days had become a routine of meticulous tasks assigned by Samuel, but her nights were filled with questions. There was something about the man's demeanor, a coldness laced with vulnerability, that kept her on edge. Samuel was a puzzle, and every interaction with him only added to the mystery. The tension between them felt like a thin wire, taut and ready to snap. As the clock ticked closer to breakfast, Helena forced herself to focus. Her task today, Samuel had said, would take her beyond the estate. She welcomed the chance to leave the suffocating walls of the mansion, but unease lingered in the pit of her stomach. Samuel's tasks were never as simple as they seemed. When she entered the dining room, Samuel was already there, seated at the head of the table as usual. Anna stood nearby, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression as unreadable as ever. The aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the room, but Helena's appetite was nowhere to be found. Samuel glanced up, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You'll be visiting one of our properties today," he said without preamble, setting down his coffee cup with a deliberate motion. Helena nodded, bracing herself for the details she knew were coming. "You'll meet with one of our partners," he continued. "They're particular about their finances, and you'll deliver these documents personally." He slid a folder across the table toward her. Helena picked it up, her heart sinking slightly as she caught sight of the contents. Financial statements, contracts, and handwritten notes, all meticulously detailed, but dense enough to make her head spin. "Why me?" she asked, unable to keep the question from slipping out. Samuel's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. "Because trust is earned, Helena, and I need to know if I can trust you." The weight of his words settled heavily on her. She nodded, unsure of what else to say. As Helena left the mansion later that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that this errand was more than it seemed. The car ride to the address Samuel had given her was long and uneventful, the cityscape gradually giving way to quiet suburbs. Her driver, a man whose name she didn't know, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When they finally arrived, Helena stepped out of the car and found herself standing before a modest office building. It was a far cry from the opulence of Samuel's estate, but there was something about its unassuming appearance that put her on edge. She entered the building and was greeted by a receptionist who ushered her into a conference room. The man waiting for her was tall and impeccably dressed, his sharp suit a testament to his success. But there was an air of cold calculation about him, a sharpness in his eyes that made Helena uneasy. "Helena," he said, his tone smooth but distant, "Samuel speaks highly of you." Helena managed a polite smile, though she doubted the sincerity of his words. "I'm here to deliver these," she said, placing the folder on the table between them. The man opened the folder and began to review its contents. His expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, displeasure, that crossed his face as he read one of the documents. "This is incomplete," he said, his voice cool. Helena's stomach dropped. "Incomplete." He slid one of the pages toward her, his finger tapping a blank space at the bottom. "This signature is missing. Without it, these agreements are worthless." Helena's mind raced. She had reviewed the documents before leaving, and everything had seemed in order. But now, doubt crept in. Had she missed something? Or had Samuel deliberately given her incomplete paperwork? "I'll make sure it's corrected," she said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if measuring her. "I hope so. Samuel doesn't usually make mistakes, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt this time." Helena left the meeting feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The man's words echoed in her mind as she rode back to the estate. Samuel doesn't usually make mistakes. Was this some kind of test? And if so, had she just failed it? When she returned to the mansion, Samuel was waiting for her in the study. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm but expectant. "How did it go?" he asked. Helena hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "There was a problem," she admitted finally. "One of the documents was missing a signature." Samuel's eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of anger, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I see," he said, his tone measured. "We'll deal with it tomorrow. For now, get some rest." Helena nodded and left the study, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel had set her up, though she had no idea why. As she climbed the stairs to her room, the cryptic message from the letter resurfaced in her thoughts. "The truth lies where the heart was last broken." Something told her that this was just the beginning, and the answers she sought were far more dangerous than she had imagined. The frost on the windows shimmered under the faint light of dawn as Helena stirred in her bed. Sleep had been elusive once again, her mind consumed by fragments of the previous day. The incomplete documents, Samuel's cryptic reaction, and the ever-present weight of the letter in her pocket, all of it swirled together, leaving her both anxious and resolute. Today, she decided she would start asking questions. The mansion was unusually quiet as she descended the grand staircase. Normally, the soft hum of activity, a distant vacuum or the faint clinking of dishes, provided a sense of life within the imposing walls. But this morning, the silence felt intentional, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She found Samuel in the solarium, a room she hadn't seen before. Sunlight streamed through its glass walls, casting a golden glow over the lush greenery that filled the space. Samuel stood by a tall fern, his posture relaxed, but his gaze distant. "You're up early," he said without turning around. "So are you?" Helena replied, stepping further into the room. Samuel finally turned to face her, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "Did you come to report something? Or is there another reason for this visit?" Helena hesitated. She had spent the night rehearsing what she might say, but now, in the face of his cool demeanor, her resolve wavered. Still, she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I want to understand what's going on," she said, her voice steady. Samuel's eyebrows lifted slightly, a hint of amusement breaking through his otherwise stoic expression. "And what makes you think I have the answers you're looking for?" "Because everything about this place, about you, feels like a puzzle," Helena said. "The work you're asking me to do, the people you're connected to, even that library. None of it adds up." Samuel's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet intensity. He crossed the room, stopping just a few feet from her. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "There's more to this than you understand. But understanding comes with a cost, Helena. Are you willing to pay it?" The weight of his words hung in the air, but Helena didn't flinch. "I've already given up everything to be here," she said. "What more is there to lose?" Samuel studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then meet me in the library tonight," he said. "If you're ready for answers, that's where we'll begin." The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks and unanswered questions. Helena threw herself into her work, organizing files and reviewing contracts, but her thoughts kept drifting to the meeting Samuel had promised. By the time night fell, she was both eager and apprehensive. When she arrived at the library, Samuel was already there, standing by the same bookshelf where she had found the letter days earlier. He held a book in his hands, its leather cover worn and frayed. "This belonged to someone I trusted," he said, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. "Someone I failed." Helena felt a chill run down her spine as he opened the book and revealed a photograph tucked inside. It showed a younger Samuel standing beside a woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. "Her name was Helena," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "She was my partner, in business and in life. And she's the reason I am who I am today." Helena's breath caught. The resemblance between the woman in the photo and herself was uncanny, though not exact. It was as if they were distant reflections of one another. "She died because of me," Samuel continued, his gaze fixed on the photograph. "Because I trusted the wrong people, and because I was too blinded by ambition to see the danger." Helena's mind raced as she tried to process his words. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Samuel looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "Because you remind me of her," he said simply, "and because the same people who betrayed her are still out there, waiting for the chance to destroy everything I've built." Helena felt her knees weaken as the weight of his confession sank in. She had expected answers, but not this. Not the revelation that she had unknowingly stepped into a story far darker and more personal than she could have imagined. As the night deepened, Samuel began to explain the intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and secrets that surrounded his world. Helena listened intently, her fear tempered by a growing resolve. She didn't know what role she was meant to play in this unfolding drama, but one thing was clear. She couldn't walk away now. The revelation from the night before lingered like a fog in Helena's mind as she moved through the mansion. Samuel's confession had shifted everything. She now understood that her presence in this house wasn't incidental. It was deliberate, calculated. But the why remained elusive, and with each passing moment, the unease in her chest grew. Helena spent the morning in her assigned office, poring over more of Samuel's files. Her fingers brushed against rows of numbers, charts, and meticulously documented transactions. She had always thought of money as a simple thing. Either you had enough to get by or you didn't. But in Samuel's world, finances were a weapon, a tool used to build alliances and crush enemies. Buried deep in the stack of papers, Helena found something that made her pulse quicken. A document stamped with a name she recognized: Garrett Industries. It was the company of the man she had delivered documents to just days earlier, the same man who had pointed out the missing signature. A string of numbers below the stamp caught her attention. They represented a series of transactions, all routed through shell companies and offshore accounts. Helena's breath caught as she realized what she was looking at. These weren't just business dealings, they were payments tied to something far more clandestine. Before she could process the implications, a sharp knock at the door startled her. Anna entered, her expression as composed as ever, though her eyes seemed to carry a hint of urgency. "Samuel needs to see you," she said. Helena nodded, slipping the document into the folder and following Anna down the hall. They walked in silence, the tension between them palpable. When they reached the study, Samuel was standing by the window, his back to them. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked, without turning around. Helena hesitated. "Found what?" Samuel turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "The connection. Garrett Industries isn't just a partner. They're part of the network that destroyed Helena. And now, they're watching me, watching us." Helena's stomach twisted. She thought of the man in the office, his sharp eyes and cold demeanor, the missing signature on the document she had delivered. Was it all part of some larger plan? "Why didn't you tell me?" Helena asked, her voice rising. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Because trust isn't given, it's earned. I needed to see if you would figure it out on your own." Helena stared at him, a mixture of anger and disbelief bubbling to the surface. "You've been testing me this entire time?" Samuel stepped closer, his voice low and measured. "Yes, and now that you've passed, there's no going back." Helena felt a chill run through her as the weight of his words settled over her. She wasn't just an assistant. She was a pawn in a game far more dangerous than she had anticipated. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you bring me into this?" Samuel hesitated, and for the first time, Helena saw a flicker of vulnerability in his expression. "Because you remind me of her," he admitted, "and because you're the only person I've found who might be strong enough to help me finish what she started." Helena's chest tightened. She didn't want to be a part of this, didn't want to carry the weight of Samuel's vendetta, but as she looked into his eyes, she realized she didn't have a choice. "What happens now?" she asked. Samuel's gaze hardened. "Now, we fight back." That night, as Helena lay awake in her bed, she thought about the path she had taken to get here. The loneliness of Christmas, the strange invitation, the letter in the library. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to assemble. But one thing was clear: the danger was real, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The mansion was quiet, but the air was heavy with anticipation. Helena paced the length of her room, her thoughts churning like a storm. Samuel's words from the previous day echoed in her mind. Now, we fight back. The fight, however, seemed impossible. She was a single person, unarmed and inexperienced, caught in the middle of a battle that spanned powerful figures, hidden alliances, and money trails that stretched across continents. And yet deep down, she felt something stirring, a quiet determination born of the hardships she had endured. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, Anna stood there, her usual composed expression tinged with something else: urgency. "Samuel wants you in the library," Anna said. "There's something you need to see." Helena followed her through the winding corridors, the dim light of the house casting long shadows on the walls. When they reached the library, Samuel was waiting, standing beside a large desk cluttered with maps, files, and what looked like security footage. "Close the door," Samuel said, his voice low. Helena did as he asked, her gaze darting to the desk. "What's all this?" she asked. "This," Samuel began, gesturing to the array of documents, "is the foundation of the plan. It's everything I've uncovered about Garrett Industries, their operations, and their connections to the people who betrayed Helena and who are now targeting me." Helena stepped closer, her eyes scanning the maps and files. Names, dates, and financial transactions were scrawled across the pages, forming a tangled web of deceit and power. But one detail stood out, a location circled in red ink. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the circled area. Samuel's expression darkened. "That's their base of operations, a private estate where they conduct their most sensitive dealings, and tomorrow you're going there." Helena froze. "What? Why me?" "Because they already know who I am," Samuel said, his tone sharp. "But you're still an unknown. They'll see you as harmless, someone they can manipulate, and that gives us the advantage." Helena's heart pounded as she stared at him. "What do you expect me to do?" Samuel slid a small device across the desk toward her. "Plant this in their server room. It's a data extractor. Once it's connected, I'll be able to access their files remotely. We'll finally have the proof we need to take them down." Helena picked up the device, its weight surprisingly light in her hand. "And if I'm caught?" Samuel's gaze didn't waver. "You won't be." The confidence in his voice was unsettling, but Helena didn't press further. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. The plan was risky, but it was also the first concrete step toward unraveling the web of lies and deceit that had ensnared them both. The next day, Helena found herself dressed in a sleek black dress, her hair pinned up elegantly, a disguise that felt entirely foreign. The driver who had taken her to Garrett Industries before now drove her to the estate, his silence a reminder of the gravity of the mission. The estate was sprawling, its grandeur rivaling Samuel's mansion. As Helena stepped out of the car, she was greeted by a woman whose smile didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Helena," the woman said. "Welcome. Mr. Garrett has been expecting you." Helena forced a polite smile, her fingers tightening around the clutch bag that concealed the device. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She was led into a grand hall where men and women in expensive suits mingled, their laughter and conversation a sharp contrast to the tension she felt. Helena moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning the room for an opportunity. It came in the form of a waiter carrying a tray of champagne. Helena feigned a stumble, spilling the contents of her glass onto her dress. "Oh no!" she exclaimed, her voice tinged with embarrassment. The waiter quickly offered to help, directing her to a nearby restroom. Helena used the opportunity to slip away, navigating the labyrinthine hallways until she found the server room Samuel had described. Her hands shook as she connected the device to the server, its small light blinking to indicate it was working. The seconds felt like hours as she waited, her ears straining for the sound of approaching footsteps. Finally, the light turned green. She removed the device and slipped it back into her bag, her heart racing as she retraced her steps to the main hall. She had just rejoined the crowd when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with the man from her earlier meeting at Garrett Industries. "Helena," he said, his smile cold. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Helena forced herself to remain calm. "I could say the same," she replied, matching his tone. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but before he could respond, a commotion broke out near the entrance. Guests turned to see what was happening, and Helena seized the distraction to slip away. When she finally returned to the car, her breath came in ragged gasps. She had done it. The device was in Samuel's hands now, and the truth was one step closer to being revealed. But as the car pulled away from the estate, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that she had been seen, that someone, somewhere, was already plotting their next move. The drive back to Samuel's estate was shrouded in a heavy silence. Helena clutched the clutch bag tightly against her lap, her mind racing with the events of the night. She had succeeded, at least she hoped she had, but the tension in her chest refused to ease. The man from Garrett Industries had recognized her. She was sure of it, and though she had escaped the estate unnoticed, the sinking feeling in her stomach told her the consequences were far from over. When she arrived, Samuel was waiting for her in the library. The room felt colder than usual, its shadows deeper and more foreboding. Samuel stood by the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "You did it," he said simply as she handed him the device. Helena nodded, her hands still trembling. "But they know I was there," she said. "They'll come for us now." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. "That was always a risk," he said, "but what we've gained is worth it. The data on this device is enough to destroy them." Helena wanted to believe him, but the fear gnawing at her refused to subside. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel turned to face her fully, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Now, we expose them," he said. "Every deal, every betrayal, every ounce of blood money they've hoarded. The world will know who they are and what they've done." Helena's heart pounded as Samuel inserted the device into his computer. The screen lit up, lines of code scrolling rapidly as the files began to upload. Helena watched in silence, the weight of what they were doing pressing down on her. The first file opened, a series of transactions linking Garrett Industries to offshore accounts and illicit activities. Helena's breath caught as she recognized some of the names listed. Politicians, CEOs, even public figures she had admired. The web of corruption was far larger than she had imagined. "This is it," Samuel said, his voice filled with a mixture of triumph and anger. "This is what they've been hiding." But as the files continued to upload, a sudden alarm blared from the computer. The screen flashed red, and Helena's stomach dropped. "What's happening?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. Samuel's expression darkened. "They've detected the breach," he said. "We don't have much time." Before Helena could respond, the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside the mansion cut through the air. She rushed to the window and saw several black SUVs pulling up to the estate. "They're here," she said, her voice trembling. Samuel grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a hidden door behind one of the bookshelves. "We need to move," he said. "There's a safe room downstairs. It's the only place they won't find us." The narrow passageway led them to a dimly lit staircase that spiraled downward. Helena's heart raced as they descended, the sound of footsteps and shouted commands echoing faintly above them. When they reached the bottom, Samuel ushered her into a small room reinforced with steel walls. Inside, there was only a single monitor connected to the mansion's security cameras. Samuel activated the feed, and Helena watched as armed men swarmed the estate, their movements coordinated and efficient. "They're not just here to scare us," Samuel said grimly. "They want to erase everything." Helena's chest tightened as the reality of their situation sank in. She had walked into this world blind, but now she was fully immersed in its darkness. The fear she felt was unlike anything she had experienced before, but beneath it was a growing resolve. "What do we do?" she asked, turning to Samuel. He met her gaze, his expression fierce. "We survive," he said, "and we finish this." Hours passed as they remained hidden, the muffled sounds of chaos above gradually fading into silence. When the monitor finally showed the SUVs leaving, Samuel exhaled deeply. "It's not over," he said, "but we've bought ourselves time." Helena nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The files they had uncovered were safe. Samuel had ensured that before the breach was detected, but the danger was far from over, and the enemies they faced would not give up easily. As they emerged from the safe room, the mansion felt like a different place. The air was heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered, and Helena knew their lives would never be the same. Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You've done more than I could have asked for," he said. "But this fight is just beginning." Helena met his gaze, the determination in her own eyes mirroring his. "Then let's finish it," she said. If you've ever found yourself in a situation where standing up for the truth came at a great cost, share your story in the comments. Your courage could inspire someone else.